Welcome to Tech Tuesday number 57. And today we're going to talk about IP strategy activities. And here I mean business activities, not games that we play. But before we start, let's take a moment of silence. We'll have many hostages that are not yet home, and we're waiting for them to come home. Okay. So this is part of still dancing around the issue of IP strategy. And there are a lot of things that are called IP strategy. And again, instead of trying to define what it is, what I thought would be helpful in trying to nibble at this watermelon is to look at activities which, when you do them in IP, they relate to IP strategy. And I will explain for each activity what is the connection to IP strategy as to compared to regular ongoing IP activity. And I will be focusing on what I call outward-facing IP strategy, meaning, you're filing patents against a competitor, or you're trying to encourage an investor to invest and things like that. And part of IP strategy is setting up your company so that it generates and maintains good IP. And that's super important. And I'm really not going to talk about it today. And special thanks to Tamir Ben David and Yaakov Blumenthal that helped me define or fine-tune some of these activities. Of course, in real life, you don't do any pure activity. You usually mix it with other activities and you get a total mess. And the order in which I'm going to talk is I'm going to start with activities that are definitely before you have a strategy. For example, the business strategy. You should probably know it before you deal with IP strategy, various types of information you might need to collect. Then I'll talk about transition activities like freedom to operate risk analysis, which does involve taking the data and analyzing it, but still doesn't, not the strategy itself, in my mind. And then I'm going to talk about activities that are components, or the output of them is components of an IP strategy. Start with prerequisites. Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to know what your business strategy is. Why? If the IP is meant to support the business, IP strategy, in order to be most effective, should be connected to the business strategy. So I'm not going to talk about what a business strategy looks like, but you need to figure out what the business strategy is. And often you also have goals. And I like SMART goals, not only, but I like them too. SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And the reason why I like them is not because they're necessarily better goals, but because when we want to ask if the IP is or is not supporting the goal, it's really helpful for that goal to be SMART. In addition, there are other things you'd like to know about the company, all sorts of context, like where is it strong, where is it weak, what resources it has, and so on. And even more information that's nice to have before you start working on IP strategy is what is the company vision? What is the market, it's trying to sell? What is a theory of success, failure, and challenge? And I've talked about these before. And often you have some key elements that are required for the company to succeed, and we want the IP to help these key elements do it. So IP strategy should, I'm saying always, but more or less always be considering these issues. Now, typo, to be clear, even if you don't have a stated strategy, your company does have a strategy. So laying out what your strategy actually is based on how you're acting is valuable if only if it helps you understand what's holding you back from having a good business strategy and IP strategy. So this is not IP strategy, but it's a super important prerequisite. Another activity, and I'm not putting these in order, is doing an audit of your registered IP. And it may sound trivial, definitely in companies that only have 1.5 patents. But in other companies, you need to know what IPs a company has. How do you do it? Well, obviously, you search in databases. I didn't write, but you might have a folder in a cabinet somewhere saying what IP a company has. But you also have to look at licensing agreements, both licensed in and licensed out. You have to check assignment records to see if the IP actually belongs to you. You need to check on others, for example, subcontractors that should have assigned it to you, and maybe they invented and didn't tell you. And basically, you should be able to generate a report that includes both the details and the top level picture of what your IP position is. What does this have to do with strategy? Well, registered IP is a very important resource which you leverage using IP strategy. And I say audit, you do it once, but you really have to have proper procedures in order to keep this information up to date. And other things you should be auditing, which are not registered IP, are the processes you have, the company culture, and the people. And I'm making a very important point here. Here we're doing an audit of what you have, but what the company could have is often more important, but it's not part of this activity. And just like you have registered IP, you also have unregistered IP. And it's not likely you'll be able to audit all of it. But if you talk to people, as well as people who have left the company, you look at publication, you look at what the company does that actually works, you look at know-how, you look at trade secrets, you look at ideas that were unfiled, you get what insights people have, you track down the data that is being used. It's a lot of detective work, but it's usually a lot of information hiding there. The larger the company, the more information. And what does this have to do with IP strategy? Again, also unregistered IP is a resource that you leverage using IP strategy. Now, why is it so difficult to do it? Because a lot of people are not aware that they have this unregistered IP. And if they are aware, they're not aware that it has value. Why not? Well, sometimes they have, you know, the wrong beliefs about what the law is, or how you use IP. Sometimes the value is not clear to them because they don't have the ability to apply the IP. And if they're not applying the IP, they don't know why it has value. Here's another activity which is also prerequisite to building an IP strategy. And just to be clear, you don't have to do all of these activities. You don't have to do any of these activities. I'm just giving you a toolbox. So invention harvesting is when you collect ideas that are waiting to be collected. And again, you talk to people, you educate them about IP and about patents, you challenge them, you do cross-fertilizing between different people in different departments. You look at the products and you analyze them. What does this have to do with strategy? Well, these inventions that you're harvesting are raw material for building an IP portfolio, and the IP portfolio will be used by the IP strategy. And there's definitely a relationship between invention harvesting and unregistered IP. And I use the word harvesting, which is, ideas just waiting to be picked up. But there's low-hanging fruit, there's ideas that are hidden, there's mining, that's when you dig in deep, and sometimes you have to refine the ideas that you get. Sometimes there's different words you can use, but they really reflect how difficult it is to collect the information that you need. And something very important, when you do invention harvesting and something is not ready yet, you should take note of it and write down this idea. We should look again in 6 months, maybe it'll be ready. Competitor analysis. It's learning about your competitors. Strategy is about competition. If there is nobody opposing you, so you can just have a plan, you don't need a strategy. And guess what? There's always somebody opposing you. Why? Because if you make money, they want to make money too. In any case, how do you do it? Well, lots of ways, but first you need to identify your competitors, whether in the present or in the future. You have to figure out what the IP is, what the product positions are, what the trajectories are, what the future needs are, or present needs. You can do this BI activity by looking in IP databases, but of course, remember that not everything in public is reliable. There's a particular type of competitor, which I call a spoiler. The spoiler doesn't want to take the market from you. They just want to ruin it. So if you think of the real estate market, a very valuable product, perhaps trade secret that they have, is a list of properties up for sale. So if somebody, instead of buying it or selling it, just publishes it on the internet, he ruins it for everybody. And something very important about competitors, we're calling them competitors, but you want to figure out if the market works better with competitors or without. Sometimes you want to have competitors, because partners could be competitors and could be partners. And competitors don't have to be selling the same product as you are. Competitors could be selling an alternative product which answers a market need in a completely different way. And they're still competitors because they take away from your success, unless you leverage them. But that's beyond this particular task. Landscapes. Let's talk about just two types of landscapes. One is what's called white space, and one is perhaps, let's call it a potential space. In white space, you do a search, you build the landscape map, you look for white spaces. In design space, you look for what the solution space might look like, what features might exist and how they might work together. And you can also look at how patentable each one of these things would be. And really the reason why you do all of this is to understand where, from an IP perspective, it might be more rewarding to do something. In general, when you talk about strategy works in a landscape. Now, unlike the real world where it's difficult to change the landscape, in the patent world, you can file a patent and that could change the landscape. But you and the competitors are competing inside some sort of, existing landscape. And it's not easy to do it because we're talking about the future and about technologies that don't exist. And you don't even know what you're looking for. And all of these landscapes are multidimensional, and seeing them in 2D is kind of, funny. And that's why one of the things that can help guide you is some sort of list of problems or challenges or needs. Just like the competitors, you also have the market and your customers. So if you know what your market looks like and how your customers act, considering that the end goal of a business strategy is often capturing market share and capturing and getting more from paying customers, I think it's clear why this information is important for building an IP strategy. In any case, some of the things you look at are what does the structure look like now? What does it look like later? Competitors, choke points, suppliers, forces you can bring to bear. I'm not going to go into details about this. What does the customer journey look like? What are the customer habits and preferences, especially regarding to how they pay? What do people not like? What is the potential value capture? Because your strategy is trying to increase your value capture, but if there's nothing left to capture, maybe you shouldn't go there. And just to note, startups often try to create a new market, not always. Disruptors, they plan on taking over an existing market by giving a product which disrupts television. Okay, so they want to take television viewers. Okay, these were all prerequisites and there are many more, but I chose to focus on these. Transitions, like I said, have some analysis involved, but they still don't get to the level of being parts of a strategy. Here's one of them, freedom to operate risk analysis. So what is it? You're trying to figure out how much risk the company faces due to infringing or some other kind of stepping on IP of other people. How can it be done? Well, first you have to figure out what your needs are in the scope. Then you do a freedom to operate search according to the first thing. You also need to do a trade secret mini audit because maybe you're using somebody else's trade secret. That's also stepping on somebody's IP. You analyze the infringement, and then you determine the size and the type of the risk, and also what the cures could look like, for example, sign event. And what does this have to do with strategy? Strategy is supposed to help you manage risk. This is the risk. If you know it, you can do a better job. And of course, some of these risks, like FTO, could be managed using non-IP tools. Now, FTO analysis always has positive sides and negative sides and is never perfect. And when we talk about risk, I have a few other FTs on the bottom. You have freedom to operate, you have freedom to pay, you have freedom to sue, and sometimes you have freedom to act even though you're infringing somebody's patent. So when you try to define what your risk is, you have to figure out what you're willing to do. Sometimes we draft a patent application. And before we draft the individual patent, we can analyze it to death about doing the best job possible. And the question we're trying to answer is, how likely are we to get, and how strong will it be when we get it, any particular invention? So, how do you do it? The standard way is you look for closest prior art. You try to figure out what it is a patent is supposed to block. Not all patents have blocking as a main job, but what is going to be blocked and how important it is. You think about what arguments might be made against you, patentable subject matter issue, especially 101. And you ask what information, if you had, would make the patent better. Now, what does this have to do with strategy? Well, patents are an important tool used by IP strategy. And ideally, you can link them with particular jobs to be done of the IP portfolio. Now, I emphasize individual patent because usually patents don't work on their own. They work with other elements. They're part of a portfolio. But the fact is that when we draft a patent application, we do this activity and we do it for strategic reasons. IP vulnerability risk opportunity analysis. Okay, so you have a company, business strategy, you have IP, and one of the questions you ask is where are they inherently weak or strong? And I'm not going to tell you the entire process, but first of all, you can look where a company in a particular field might be weak. And I'll give you an example from quantum computing. There are many different ways of making a quantum computer. Each one has its own positives and negatives. But what we can say for sure is that if more than one of these ways is likely to work, getting a patent on your way is not going to block other people from selling quantum computers. Okay, so that's an inherent weakness of IP in quantum computing. It's not to say you can't get wonderful, broad, and very valuable patents, but that's an inherent property of the field. But we look not only at a generic company, we look at your particular company, and your particular company has certain resources, it has certain strategy and goals, and they might have vulnerability. So we look at places where IP is weak, and for the past, I don't know, over 10 years, software patents in the US were weak, business patents were very weak. You identify where the market creates IP issues, and you identify dangers caused by competitors. And what does this have to do with IP strategy? IP strategy is hopefully leveraging your strengths and covering for the weakness, both of the IP and the company. So, it's valuable to know where you're strong and where you're weak. Now, this is, of course, super dynamic. So you can't just do it once. Gil taught me this term, RFI, request for invention. Okay, so request for invention is when somebody asks the company to make the invention. The best thing it could be is if the business decision makers realize that they need IP in order to do something. Why is it the best? It means they care about IP. Good is when somebody in one of the departments like marketing say that they need certain IP. Not exciting is when the IP department on its own identifies that it would be nice to have an invention. Okay, because that really means that the other departments aren't thinking enough about IP. In any case, you usually go to R&D or some other company unit, they do research, experiments, they think about it, and then the IP department makes sure that the IP that you are trying to get actually meets the original need. How it relates to strategy? Well, we said before that patents have value. Patents are cheap. And most important here, we're talking about patents that come from an analysis of need of a company or what the company could use to be more valuable. Now, even if your business decision makers told you they need certain IP, it would be even better if they gave you top-down guidance on what they need. Okay, so now let's talk about a few strategy components. Again, not a complete strategy, but you're going to recognize these as nearly strategy. Well, one of these activities, checking to see the alignment between your IP and the business needs. If you remember the very beginning, I said that the IP strategy is supposed to support the business strategy, so you need to know what the business strategy is. Well, does your IP support your business strategy? A very important activity. And to the extent that it doesn't, it leads you to define changes. How do you do it? Well, first, we do what we said before. We figure out the business needs, goal, strategy. Then, again, we talked about it before, we collect what IP we have. Then, for example, we build a job to be done table which shows which goals are supported by which IP. And you can be optimistic. If you have a patent application, you can assume that you're going to do the right thing. And one more step, which would be nice, is to figure out what is your ideal for what kind of support you're expecting from the IP. In any case, you determine how well the business is actually supported, how much of the IP doesn't have a meaningful job to be done. And you can also look overall at the bang for the buck that you're getting, how much you're spending on IP and how much value it's giving you. And you look for gaps between the IP and the business, and it's never the fault of the business. So you try to explain these gaps based on what your IP strategy is and maybe how it should be changed. Another similar activity is pre-deal, which is something you do before due diligence. And really, it's looking at the state of your IP from somebody from the outside looking in, as it's done a due diligence. So you do it before the due diligence, a few months before the due diligence, so you have time to fix it if you need. So how do you do it? Well, you put together a due diligence package, and if you can't, well, that's a very bad sign. You choose an external entity, it's the best way to do it, somebody naive to your company. You decide what point of view they should be taking. You know, investors that come look at your company, each one has a different point of view on what they want to see in IP and how important it is and what the deal looks like and so on. You review the IP and you also review descriptions, which hopefully you can provide, of how the IP is used or how the IP helps the company. And I'm saying that I haven't seen due diligences where they don't care about the big three, which are who owns the patent, is it patentable, and why do you think you have freedom to operate? You don't have to have, you know, an official opinion, but it's quite unusual that people don't care about these three. And if you can also talk about more complex strategy, even better. And while I didn't talk about internal policies, in some due diligences, they actually want to know what your internal policies for generating and maintaining IP. So what does this have to do with strategy? Well, the IP strategy should be seen, and one of the times that it's looked at is during due diligence, which is a very important milestone. Now there's an activity called IP portfolio building. And really what it is fattening up your IP portfolio. Why is this connected to strategy? Because IP strategy uses your portfolio both as a tool and as some sort of message. So if you have more, it gives a certain message. Now, how do you do it? I vote bet. Maybe it's not the best, but in a second, I'm going to talk about IP design. Good is when you go both top down from the needs of the company and bottom up from your invention to identify needs and potential values, potential inventions, and then build a portfolio based on these things. It's so-so if you identify what features appear to be interesting or important to you or to your competitors, and that's what you file patents on. And, you know, meh is we need 53 patents, draft 53 patents for me. Whichever one of these methods you're using, you usually do some sort of triage, and you often use some sort of continuation divisional strategy. Meaning you already have an application, already has an four inventions, just file three divisionals now, and you have portfolios that's three applications bigger. When we talk about fattening up your portfolio, if you have an IP strategy that can guide you as to what type of enhancement you need to have in the portfolio. And of course, budget. People doing this don't always realize that filing patents cost money and getting them costs money and keeping them alive costs money. Okay, IP design. So IP design very generally is designing the IP that a company needs. And I'm giving you one way of doing it. And I want to clarify that I'm defining IP design in a narrow sense of including just freedom to operate and ability to block other people. And what do we do? Well, first we look at the market, including the future. In the market, we figure out what is necessary in order to succeed, both for you and for your competitors. We identify potential choke points. Choke points are places where if you get a patent, it'll be very significant because it will choke off the ability to go that way. Then you do a triage because it's always about the money. And then you do whatever patenting and freedom to operate activities that the process brought up. And sometimes you want to do non-IP activity like R&D. Something very important to do with IP and directly connected to IP strategy is option generation. And I'm defining that as generating IP that does not support your current business strategy. And why are you doing it? Because you want to generate optionality, because you want to deal with uncertainty. Of course, you have no idea what's going to happen if any of this IP will be valuable, and you have to decide how much of your budget is spent on it. But generating options, I believe, is a very important thing to do with IP. And how do you do it? Well, step number one is magic. That should give you a hint. You figure out where the company might go, maybe based on luck, maybe based on looking at the core competence of the company, maybe use methods known in futurism like the boroscope. In any case, for each one of these alternative realities, we should say, you should identify at least one valuable IP item. Okay, and this item could be something that gives me income, I need for freedom, an IP position which can block other people, whichever. And at the same time, you look at your existing IP and ask, where can I get one of these effects using refocusing? And as before, you do some sort of triaging activity, you look at the budget, and you execute. IP needs to work with things that are not IP. And when I say other, I mean other things in your company. So one example is marketing. IP and marketing work very nicely together unless they work very not nicely together. Now, as part of strategy, your goal is to support some sort of business goal. That business goal is probably being supported not only by IP, but also by other functions in the company. So it's important to identify where you can work together with them. And one way of doing it, perhaps, and I'm describing a way of doing it, but in companies that have an internal IP function, this should be done continuously. It's not a one-off. You collect the goals of the IP strategy, you collect the goals of the other company functions, and you look for what you have and what could be synergies and conflicts. And you also look for solutions to IP needs that can be enhanced by others. And bottom line, you have to talk with these other functions and work together with them. And I gave two examples. One is marketing, which is a very important function to work with. A function which many companies don't have is information control. Now, patents are an information function. You publish stuff, people read it. So is your website. So are articles by researchers associated with your company. All of these fall under information control, and many companies actually don't have such a function, which of course makes it difficult for them to do deception and surprise. Now, I talked about IP working with non-IP, but also IP works with other IP. The cooperation of a patent with a trade secret or a patent with a trademark, also important. CAP, company as a product. What is that? That is when you build a part of the IP strategy, okay, strategizing to support the sale of the company itself. Okay, not everybody needs to do it, not everybody wants to do it, but if you are doing it, it makes sense that your IP be suitable and support this goal. And perhaps one way of doing it is figuring out who this buyer is going to be and what the profile might be. Do you have any leverage? Then you look at options of what it is that you might be trying to sell to them. Then you look at issues that would directly interfere with the price you want to get, with the sales process, or with closing the deal. All of these have non-IP issues, but many of them have IP issues. Either they cause a problem or IP could help. Now you generate or you refocus to get that IP. And of course, this is very information control centric, because if you're trying to sell the company, marketing should be doing two jobs, selling the product and selling the company. You have to have control over it. Now, in many companies, this is the main company goal, so you should be doing it. I want to distinguish between markets where you can make a list of the people who might want to buy you, and it can be a short list, and markets where you can't do it. Even if you can't make a short list of who might want to buy you, it is still valuable to try to characterize who might want to buy you. And when you do this cap IP strategy, it's usually not going to be alone. Usually you're going to want to have normative IP, let's say the results of an IP design process, because your company has to be at least, usually, at least okay from an IP perspective. And you might want to have some IP strategy having to do with growth and sales of the company. Sometimes you want to build an ecosystem or control an ecosystem. That's very high level strategy. And guess what? It's an activity you have to do in order to get there. And I'm not going to tell you how to do it. No room on one page. But IP is very powerful in this respect, because if you think about an ecosystem has separate companies which you don't have control over. If you don't have, legal control over the other companies, why should they do what you want? Well, one of the answers is because I have IP. And regarding strategy, look at it this way. If the ecosystem is running properly, the other companies are working for you. You can't do better leverage than that. And ecosystems are complex. There's so many different ways you can fail, including somebody can simply take over the ecosystem. Okay, so what I've given you now is a slew of IP strategy activities. And here's a few more components, which I don't think we have time to talk about, but just so you'll see that I really meant it, that there's a lot. Actually generating an IP plan based on whatever strategy you have. Strategizing the IP before you go into head-to-head with some opponent. Or the opposite, you might have a goal like licensing. The general concept of positioning. You want your company to be positioned with a strong IP portfolio, which gives you flexibility to move around. A trade secret strategy. Obviously, it's a part of IP strategy, but I'm calling it out because of this great quote that I saw, that IP strategy, trade secret strategy is usually an afterthought in IP strategy, if any exists. Okay, so a lot of people don't have a clear IP strategy, and even less a trade secret strategy. And at the very, very beginning, when you build a company, the design of the company, the structure, which way it's going to go, how it's going to grow, can all depend on IP issues. Now, most of this has to do with internal facing stuff, which I did not talk about. In any case, IP strategy is a complex and ongoing activity, and I only basically told you, one-off activities. But it might be easier to deal with this complexity of IP strategy by talking about little pieces. And I've shown you little pieces, but strategy by nature usually needs to be coherent. So I didn't talk about ongoing activities much. I didn't talk about inwards-facing activities. I'm definitely telling you that any one of these activities, you should be able to, and you should justify them to decision makers and to people with budget. They all have risk, and they all have very substantial potential benefit, if only as a result of having a working IP strategy. So in order to put the whole thing into focus, here's just an exercise to think about. I gave you a lot of IP activities, and which one would you do first in each one of the following companies? So I have one company, small startup with a high energy density battery technology. I have a regional food manufacturer, okay? They have a new snack, which is similar to other snacks in other countries. Somebody is making an EV manufacturer. Somebody is making clothes which don't quite look the same as clothes sold by other people. I have an app to deliver mental therapy to dogs. Okay, obviously each one of these companies is very, very different. And that also means that the problems are different, and it also means that the first activity you might want to do is different. And I'm asking you, which one would you do first? And which one do you feel is most important for each one? So we're now going to move to comments. I'm going to stop the recording.